This video is going to be my midterm review of the Transition Spur. So if you're not too familiar with the Spur, it is a mid-travel 29er trail bike, and one that separates itself from other 29er trail bikes in the fact that it's only 26 pounds or a little more. And so that really puts it into a category that kind of blurs cross country and trail. But I found that, so I'll just say it right now. This bike climbs almost as good as my cross country bike and descends as good as any trail bike that I've ever ridden. So this video is after I did a 4-day bike testing trip to the mountains, and it was really the time that I put it through its paces in the mountains. And so I want to talk about how it did on that trip, how it did climbing, and how it did descending. So let's talk about climbing first, since that's what you got to do before you can descend on the bike. This is the first bike that I've had that is a flex rear triangle. So it doesn't use the other types of suspension that I'm used to, which is a more floating pivot style, like Giant Maestro, like Santa Cruz VPP, like Niner CVA. And I was honestly a little apprehensive about that. However, after riding up in the mountains and really pushing hard up some super steep climbs, we're talking some of them were 20% or more, a lot of them technical, this bike did absolutely amazing. Now, when you get up on the pedals and stand up out of the saddle, it does bob a little bit, but it's not bad. And you know, this is the type of bike, if you just get into like a nice smooth climbing rhythm, it will get up almost as good as any cross-country bike you've ridden. And the trip that I went on recently, several of the guys were on cross-country bikes, and I really didn't have any problems keeping up with them. In fact, I dropped some of them on this bike. So climbing on this bike is superb. One thing that I like about this bike on both the climbs and the descents is the lower bottom bracket. And so what I found was when climbing on really technical terrain, it took a little less effort to keep your weight centered and balanced. And bikes with a higher bottom bracket where you feel a little bit more top heavy, you find yourself shifting your weight around to keep your balance. I mean, we're talking going 2 to 4 miles an hour because it's so steep. And when you get to those technical sections, that's roots or rocks or whatever, because the bottom bracket's lower, you don't have to shift your weight around as much. I didn't get the pedal strikes that I was expecting. So when I rode this bike on really slow technical terrain, I did have a few pedal strikes, but up in the mountains, it was a non-issue. I don't really know exactly why, but even though the bottom bracket's low, I didn't really have the pedal strikes that I was expecting. So because this bike is so light and it has 29er wheels, it really gets over those technical features that you may encounter on a climb. So, you know, the climbs that we were doing, I mean, you'd look up ahead and you'd see a root or a rock and you just almost dread having to get the bike up and over it. But this, better than any trail bike that I've ridden, this bike gets over those types of features. Again, the fact that it's so light, and also, you know, that it has 29er wheels. Something else that I was kind of expecting on this bike is having the front end wander. So again, when it gets really steep, on some bikes, the front end is kind of hard to keep in control. You feel like it gets real light and it's hard to keep the front end from, you know, holding a line. I didn't really have that issue, even though this bike has a 66-degree head angle, which is, you know, fairly slack for a 29er trail bike. I think part of that is the bottom bracket being lower, your center of gravity is lower, and the wheelbase is a little bit longer. It kept the front end more manageable on steep climbs. So I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a broken record, but the lightness of this bike puts it, I think, ahead of a lot of other bikes in this mid-travel 29er category, and it's something that I really came to appreciate. So those long climbs, 20, 30, 45-minute climbs where, you know, 3 pounds can make a pretty big difference in how fresh you feel when you get to the top of the climb. Now let's talk about descending, which for most of us is the funnest thing you can do on a bike, at least it is for me. This bike totally surprised me on the descents. I'm used to trail bikes that have a little bit more front end travel. So my cross-country bike has 120. This bike has 120, but it's the geometry that, I'll just say it right now, I think Transition have absolutely nailed the geometry on this bike. The 66-degree head angle. And you know, another thing that I didn't mention about the climbing is the steeper seat tube angle. That also makes the bike more manageable on those really steep climbs. So on the descents, the geometry, the lower bottom bracket, the longer wheelbase, the slacker head angle, this bike is so planted on the descents. The rear end, to me, actually felt like it had more than 120 millimeters of travel because of the frame flex. So the frame flex is very unique to this bike. So it does not have any pivots in the back of the triangle, and also the frame flexes. And so that, again, gives the bike a feeling like it has more travel, but it also gives it a feeling when you're kind of coming out of a corner. It gives it a springy, lively feel. Even though it may not be as laterally stiff as some of the other bikes that I've ridden. And you know, I made a video talking about how this bike did in slow tech, and I said I felt like it came off its line a little bit. I could feel the frame flex a little bit. That is really unique terrain. I mean, you're going super slow and it's super tight, up and down. Most people don't ride that type of terrain. When I got to the mountains on this bike, it did not bother me that the frame flexed. In fact, there were sections where I actually preferred it because of the way the bike popped in and out of the corners. Something else that's really unique about this bike, again, is the weight. And so when you're coming down a hill, you feel like you can just throw this bike around more on the descents, and it's such a unique riding bike. It's really unlike any bike that I've ridden. It has the weight of a cross-country bike, but the geo of a modern trail bike, and you can just throw it around rocks and roots and just toss it around the trail. Now, I will say one thing that you have to be careful of on this bike is the fact that the geo feels a tad more enduro than some other trail bikes that I've ridden. You have to be careful that you don't push too hard through a rock garden. You know, I did bottom out the suspension a few times, so it's only 120, and you get so confident on the slacker geo that you may hit stuff a little bit harder than you really should with a bike with this much travel. In fact, one of the times I pinched the rear tire, so I probably had a little bit too less pressure than I should have had in the tire. In fact, I didn't check the tire pressure before I rode. I checked it the night before, but I pushed the rim pretty hard up against a rock and pinched the tire and flatted the tire. But it was because I just felt so confident on this bike. I felt like I was on an enduro bike. Even though you have to be more careful when going through rock gardens and things like that, the fact that you can toss it around more just allows you to get maybe around stuff that on an enduro bike you would just plow through without even thinking about it. Since this is a midterm review, I'll touch on a few of the components and how they're doing so far. Basically, no problems at all with the shifting and the braking. I really like SRAM. You know, I've said it before in my other videos. I prefer Shimano, but since I have SRAM on all of my mountain bikes now, except for one, I like the feeling of SRAM when going back and forth between those other bikes, because the Shimano brakes have a real grabby feel, which I actually like, but it's kind of hard to transition, no pun intended, between Shimano and SRAM brakes. So the fact that this comes with SRAM is totally fine with me. I've said it before in my videos, I'm a fan of Fox suspension. I've even thought about getting a Fox Talus for this bike, but I am really impressed with the RockShox Sid Ultimate that comes on this bike, the fork. It's got 35 mil stanchion tubes. I feel like the front end is plenty stiff because of that. And so I don't have any plans at this point to change out the fork. We'll see as time goes on, but I'm again really impressed with the RockShox Sid Ultimate. Also, the RockShox Sid Lux rear shock has been fine. Like I mentioned in one of my videos where I compared this bike to the 900 Jet 9, I don't really miss the fact that the suspension does not have a lot of adjustments. It's only fully open or locked out. The nice thing about that is when you get to the top of a climb, you really don't have to think about it. So when I'm climbing on this bike on single track, I kept the suspension open on the fork and the shock. Did not have a problem with it moving around too much. You know, it's only 120 mil travel, so you don't really have to think about, well, I got to lock it out on this single track. Now, I did lock it out on a gravel road just so I could get out of the saddle and crank. And what I like about it when you lock it out is that it's fully locked out. So on those gravel road sections, when, again, you want to get out of the saddle, the bike does not move at all when both the rear and the front fork are locked out. A few other component highlights. I'm liking the DT Swiss 1700 wheel set. Plenty stiff for an aluminum wheel set. I may, down the road, change these wheels to carbon. We'll see. I'm impressed with these. Like I said, I like the compliance, the vertical compliance of alloy wheels, but the lateral stiffness of the DT Swiss 1700s has really impressed me. To wrap up this midterm review of the Transition Spur, this is just a great all-around bike. The trip that I went on recently was in the North Georgia mountains, and there were very few trails and very few sections where I wanted a longer travel bike. There are times when I like my enduro bike, especially the rougher stuff like up in Pisgah. But in the North Georgia mountains and trails like that that are less technical, this bike is perfect. You don't want to lug around a really heavy bike if you don't need it. That's just the bottom line, and that's where the Transition Spur really comes in. It's a bike that descends better than you would think it descends. It climbs amazing, and it's just one of those bikes that I look forward to riding this thing, and I just want to go on another trip and ride this bike. It's that good. So any questions or comments that you have so far about this bike, about this video and other videos that I made, go ahead and leave those. Have you ridden this bike? I'm really curious to know how you like it. Thanks for watching.